Welcome to Rainer Radio. Today I have my guest, Chris Masterjohn, who's a PhD in Nutritional Sciences. Um, Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about your professional background? I see that you were a researcher before being a professor of health and nutrition.
Yeah, well, I followed the standard academic route, although I had been doing, independent research going back like years before I actually started the academic route. But I got my PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Connecticut in 2012. Then I went and did a postdoctoral research project for almost 2 years at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and then I was an assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences at Brooklyn College in Brooklyn, New York, and now I'm back full circle doing independent literature-based research and sharing strategies that I can pull out of the science to help people improve their health.
So I first heard about you years back because you were very involved in the ancestral health world. So how did you get kind of more into that sphere, that kind of paleo-esque and adjacent type topics?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess you could go back to how I originally got anywhere peripheral to that, which really the entry point for me was the Weston A. Price world. And I had been interested in nutritional science, or interested in health and learning about nutrition going back to my teenage years, because my mom had done a lot of her own self-healing journey in alternative medicine and those areas, and that kind of left me with the impression that it was things worth knowing about, which also got me into a lot of trouble because I wound up becoming a vegan. My teeth started falling apart, my brain started falling apart, my gut started falling apart, and luckily my teeth were among the things that started falling apart when I was a vegan, because when I was an undergrad and I was working in the UMass dining hall, my boss, later friend Wayne, gave me a pamphlet about raw milk that he picked up from the farm in New Hampshire. This was in Massachusetts. Back in the day, you had to cross state lines to try to find some raw milk. And the farm that he went to had a pamphlet that talked about the work of Weston Price, who was a dental researcher turned pioneer in nutritional anthropology circa 1920s and 30s is when he did his anthropological research, culminating in his, his magnum opus, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, in which he basically was arguing that, well, he called his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, not Nutrition and Tooth Decay, because what his research ultimately led to was this idea that modern foods were responsible for all of the things that we take for granted as diseases of aging, which he broadly classified as physical degeneration. But his initial journey into that anthropological research was actually to try to understand the causes and consequences of tooth decay, because he did 25 years of experimentation in the United States trying to understand that in a laboratory context. But what he found was everyone in the United States had tooth decay. And so he said, well, if I want to do a scientific experiment, I need some controls. And, not everyone, but almost everyone in the United States had rampant tooth decay at that time. And so he had heard in the ethnographic literature that some of these non-modernized populations that anthropologists were interested in studying, like largely for cultural reasons, to gain an understanding of who these people are before they disappeared. Many of them mentioned that these people had remarkably perfect teeth, and so Price said, well, here are my controls. And so he went out, um, in order to understand what is different about populations that do not have tooth decay, from the American population, which where tooth decay was basically universal. And because I, at that time when I was vegan, had a mouthful of tooth decay, I had 15 cavities and needed two root canals. this is what drew me in. I said, aha, immunity to tooth decay. I want in on that. And little did I realize that I would revolutionize my mental health and all kinds of other things going on in me, while trying to fix my teeth. Um, but as a result of all the kind of reversal of, I would say more than reversal, like complete reversal of all the damage that I did when I was vegan, and then achieving a level of health that I'd never had when I was pre-vegan, uh, through the principles that I learned from Weston Price, which is very much about nose to tail eating and nutrient dense animal products. And that was my entry into, this is really kind of pre paleo in a way. So this, I believe, was probably before Lauren Cordain had written his book, and was definitely before paleo had kind of grown to be something bigger than Lauren Cordain's book. Um, and I think what Weston Price movement is much more oriented towards going back to the world of our great grandparents than it is back to before the agricultural revolution. Um, but there's a lot there's a lot of commonality between someone who wants to rewind what the industrial revolution did to food, and someone who wants to rewind what the agricultural revolution did to food. And so as a result of that, when I was in grad school, I was writing a blog about all the basically leftover stuff that didn't make the cut in what I was doing officially for my research. And I wasn't checking the stats or anything like that. But at some point, I decided to check the stats, and I saw that I was getting a lot of traffic, and it was all coming from people who were in the paleo movement, which I didn't know existed. And then that was my entry into the paleo world. And so that's when I started presenting at Ancestral Health Symposium, for example, um, Paleo FX once. AHS was a regular for me. Um, and that's kind of how I wound up, um, I would say, paleo adjacent.
So, in this type of approach to nutrition, whether it be, like you said, like, should we eat like some primitive caveman, or should we eat like, our great great grandparents did? There's all these kind of diets and movements which are, yes, they're all adjacent to each other. So, if you can call it ancestral health, you can call it paleo, you can call it Weston A. Price, and then there's, the keto is largely attached to a lot of these things, and then primal, whether it be the Mark Sisson primal, or like the Autogenous von der Planet's raw primal, carnivore diets. There's there are very different implementations of these things. It seems like the one mainstay of it all is kind of centered around meat more than anything else, and then everything else is kind of like depending on maybe individual philosophies of these different movements where they branch off. And I was wondering what you think about, since you mentioned Weston A. Price, let's start there. I believe he said that the healthiest population that he found, I don't know if it was in the whole world, but maybe just in all of Africa, were the Dinka. And I think their diet is mostly fish and cereal grains, as opposed to like, a Maasai type meat and milk diet. Do you like one, is that some, can you like confirm, is that exactly kind of what he had said? And like, what do you think about that type of diet, being the healthiest that he found?
Yeah. No, I have no idea what he said about that.
Okay.
I don't remember. It's been years since I read the book. I've read it a couple times and taken notes, but I don't remember. But B, I think an observation like that is borderline useless. And Price did make some observations like that, but it and I think he probably read into it way more than he should have, even though it was never his main point to make those comparisons. But I think the core value of Price's work is comparing the same population where Price could observe people with very similar genetics who had started importing modern foods and had not. So what he often tried, and he was very deliberate about trying to construct this. And so all over the globe, what he did was he would try to find um, try to find like a port town, for example, where some number of miles west, I'm just making this up, but like fairly nearby, there were people who did not have a port that opened up, and you had unbroken generations of eating the traditional foods. And then in the port town, you could directly trace the amount of time where the people had access to the modernized foods, and so you could compare equalized genetics between the two towns. And then within the town, with the port town, you could take a family where a very, young child may have been raised while the mother was eating modern foods in utero, and then the older brother had started eating modern foods recently, but was, went through all of his development before anyone had access to the modern foods. And then the oldest brother was like, why are you eating this crap? I would never touch that with a 10-foot pole. And then so he was able to compare the two towns, equating for the genetics. Especially given that these, I think by modern standards, all these villages were fairly inbred, just in the sense that there's nowhere near the amount of opportunities for global interconnectedness that we have today. Um, and then so his high quality observation was just comparing the health of the two towns because the genetics is controlled for. And then I would kind of classify this as very interesting anecdotal level information. Was okay, in the course of exposure in a family, what happens to someone who starts eating these foods as a teenager or as an adult, and then what happens to someone who was born in utero to a mother who had started eating these foods. And I think I wouldn't I mean, you can't do that experimentally, and you can't do it in a highly controlled manner. But it's a very interesting. I think Price, really nothing at all was known about genetics back in Price's day, and much of what was believed was straight up absurd. So one of Price's goals was to refute the notion that crowded teeth was due to race mixing. And so some people, like, one of the common hypotheses in that day was that some races of people have big mouths and big teeth, and some races of people have small mouths and small teeth. And if you had a mother and a father who were not sufficiently genetically homogeneous, you could mix the genes for big teeth with the genes for small mouths, and you could get crowded teeth. And this is, I don't think anyone with any expertise in genetics would not absolutely laugh at how utterly stupid this sounds today. But this is the point. Like, people at that time were essentially in the process of solidifying the understanding of DNA as the basis for the inheritance of traits that Gregor Mendel had discovered without understanding anything about the molecular basis much earlier before, at a time where Mendel only knew about monogenic traits, which meant that he could show, like in a plant, that you could mix, interbreed plants and show that there is one single hereditary factor that controls one single trait, which applies to almost nothing in the human body. We now know that most traits are polygenic, most genes are pleiotropic in their effects, meaning one gene has many effects and one effect has many genes that go into it. And there's almost no such thing as a single hereditary factor that can be passed down, certainly not for the one for the teeth and one for the mouth.
Right, like
um
Mendel's, it wasn't his thing like pink flowers and white flowers, I believe, like in crop
I don't
or
remember the
okay.
specific traits
Yeah.
that Mendel, that yeah, I don't remember what the traits were. um but anyway, so Price had no basis to appreciate how the genetics of one group could easily be wildly different from the genetics of another group, especially in Africa, where we now know that even to this day, there's tremendously more genetic diversity among Africans in Africa than anywhere else. If you just compare the range of genetic variation in Europeans to or African Americans to Africans. There's just a tremendous amount of genetic diversity in the African continent that doesn't exist anywhere else. Um, and then on top of that, there's just now I would say there's clear examples where you could point something out about one of the groups that he studied, and it's obviously a result of genetics. So in the Inuit, for example, the Inuit had a remarkably lower rate of tooth decay than most of the other groups. And so you could compare like the Inuit to the Swiss, and the Swiss have a higher. I was talking to a friend one time who's very familiar with Price's work, and he's like, well, look at the Inuit and the Swiss. The Swiss had, even the non-modernized Swiss had a very high rate of tooth decay compared to the Inuit. The problem is that most, well, actually, I don't, this might only be true of white Europeans, but um, which has sort of like been normal for much of the literature, right? But like the standard textbook physiology is that you will always sacrifice the calcium in your if you have a limited supply of calcium, you will always sacrifice your bones for the sake of your nervous system. And there's a physiology that's behind this, mediated by parathyroid hormone and calcitriol, which are hormones that regulate vitamin D, regulate and are regulated by vitamin D, phosphorus, and calcium principally. And the Inuit have the reverse physiology of the textbooks. They will sacrifice their nervous system for the sake of their bones. And this is characterized by remarkably low levels of PTH, regardless of the diet that they're eating, but especially on their native diet, right? So the Inuit on the native diet have the lowest PTH, but even the Inuit on modernized diets have lower PTH than any person of white European ancestry has.
Hmm.
And what this and as a result of that, there is a much higher rate of tetany in the Inuit, which is the neuromuscular consequences of hypocalcemia, where what the textbook version of that is, I guess you could make a spectrum from the muscular effects where you just have a muscle problem at the level of twitching, and then the most extreme case would be seizures on the other hand, on the other side of that, where the it's not just the muscles that are dysfunctioning, but the whole, from the central nervous system to everything else is dysfunctioning. But they also have um, a very unique mental phenomenon called pibloktok, which is um, basically someone goes into a 3-day state of hysteria, um, running around doing crazy stuff, totally delusional, often ending in a prolonged coma. And the research on this phenomenon suggests that that it is a consequence of hypocalcemic tetany, because it correlates seasonally, and it correlates geographically with where you would expect the vitamin D and calcium intakes to be the lowest, right? So it tends to occur inland where people are eating less fish during seasons where they do not have as much access to fish or the sun, among groups that did not engage in pulverized bone to be preserved for a year-round supply of calcium. And so in those groups, in those seasons, in those geographies, this is where the incidence of this is very high. And it essentially, I mean, basically their teeth are so great because their genetics have been designed to support their skeletal health above everything else. And it's been speculated that this might be a result of the incredibly harsh environment they have, where a broken bone might be much more fatal and catastrophic to reproductive fitness than it might be elsewhere, um, because the ability to endure extreme physical um, hardship is not even hardship, but hardship's not the right word, because if you're an agricultural person breaking your back in the field all day, it's different. Like the Inuit often had to do like enormously ridiculous feats of um like obstacle course level, like aerial obstacle course level feats to get food. Like they might go after eggs that required like going off some cliff with a rope or something like that. Um, and so I think because of that environment, their genetics were formed to highly prioritize their skeletal system over their nervous system. But Price had no way on earth of knowing anything like that. Um, so yeah, I don't think you can compare. I don't think you can make high quality inferences from comparing different groups that Price studied.
So I want to get it, because you've done work on the Inuit on their genetic mutation about getting into ketosis, and I want to get into that. But
Yeah, sure.
you know, on that topic of ancestral diets, it does seem like the greater sphere of media and information that comes out about that does seem to kind of negate uh, specific genetics and genetic variation in that. And I think that when you see things that go back to like being a caveman, it's like our ancestors, and it's like, well, whose ancestors? As if there hasn't been massive change and isolation and different environments and different selective pressures. Um, do you think that something resembling an ancestral diet for an individual, looking back at their own ancestry, is something that is important or can be extremely useful in determining, what might be the best route for improving their health? Or, are we even can you be so mixed that such a thing is kind of like beyond ability at this point?
More the latter than the former. So yeah, I think that before, I mean, right now, I would say we're in the era where whole genome sequencing has become affordable for pretty much anyone who makes expenditures on their health, right? Like if you can afford to buy whey protein or something like that, you can certainly afford to save $200 or $400 to do whole genome sequencing. And the interpretive interface on that is not up to snuff at all for helping someone to understand what they eat. So like right now, that's kind of like what I'm in the thick of, is working with this stuff. And I think it'll be a lot, which I think the stuff, even the stuff on SMP chips like 23andMe and Ancestry, I think is borderline useless. And that's, everyone who's trying to do anything with health and nutrition stuff is using those. Um, and so I think most of that is borderline useless, and it's all gonna, at some point, I would say I will probably pave the way towards using rare genes instead of common polymorphisms towards helping people figure out what they should eat. And I guess that's neither here nor there now. But certainly what I'm learning from that, I would say, is that there's no way on earth that it could possibly be very useful to look at your ancestry and determine specifically what you should eat out of the context of um, what we know as a baseline is the possible selection of healthy foods. I mean, certainly it's like if you want to use that as your heuristic to say, well, I'm not going to eat um, Fruit Loops because my ancestors didn't have them, then yeah, it's going to work, to some extent. But I mean, but that's like so obvious to anyone who's doing like, a carnivore and a vegan, like a carnivore, a vegan, and a high vegetable paleo person walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "What do you think about Fruit Loops?" And they all say, "Yeah, like, yeah, no." Right, like that's sort of like the end of that, right? But um, so there's a couple things. So first of all, I might be a little bit biased because I'm a complete mutt in terms of the like the culturally the most ancestry that I have any attachment to is my Greek heritage, which is 1/16. And then I don't know my biological father, but if I go into 23andMe and I subtract my mom's ancestry from his from mine, then I can infer my biological father, who appears to be more genetically diverse than my mom thought he was. And it's just, I'm at least 7, 8, 9 different nationalities or whatever. But I think that's kind of neither here nor there because within any of these, so what you referenced before was that among the Inuit, there is one gene for a transporter that allows fatty acids to get into the mitochondria to be burned for energy, where they have almost universally there is a presence of one or more, um, each person can have two of these genes, one from the mother and one from the father, and basically having at least one of them is nearly universal among some of, not every group of Arctic indigenous Arctic people, but among certain groups of the Inuit, it's almost completely taken over. And I mean, even that, I would say what you should. And so this gene is considered an inborn error of metabolism. You go into an inborn error of metabolism textbook on rare genetic defects in metabolic pathways, and you'll find it listed in there. And so it's basically like, um, by one standard of looking at it, by the genetic analysis standard of looking at it, they all have a genetic disorder. But I mean, on a practical level or like a clinical level of looking at it, there's a fairly low rate of the actual consequences of that metabolic disorder, which is basically in the fasting state, they become vulnerable to hypoglycemia and have seizures. Um, Biochemically, it's been very hard to find Inuit that have appreciable ketones in their urine or their blood. And so it does seem to dramatically lower the ability to have ketogenesis. But there, you ask 5 different people who are engaging on this topic, and you get 5 different answers about if anything, this means for what they should be eating. But the problem is, if you go in those populations and you do a whole genome sequencing and look for all the other mutations in rare diseases that they have, I bet you anything that they all have extremely unique profile for each individual. Because um, there's a there's a quote from an episode of House where House MD House says to Wilson, "I need a genetic disease," and Wilson says, "You're probably carrying a few," and that refers to the fact that, and now we actually have some pretty good data on it recently. But um, basically, the average person carries one or two genes for rare genetic diseases that impart a 50% effect of that disease on their metabolism that is way more. So I'm in the middle, like right now I'm buried in a spreadsheet, and I've gotten about 10% of the work done, but I'm taking 1,800 genetic diseases for which the average person has one or two of them, not the disease but the gene for it, because most of them are recessive. um, and I'm classifying them according to whether they have implications for whether you would do better on protein, fat, or carbohydrate, or whether you would do better if you supplemented with a specific vitamin or things of that nature that are nutritionally actionable. And I don't have the numbers yet because I haven't finished, but I'm guessing that this is going to show that something like 40% of people have unique idiosyncratic bottlenecks in their nutrient metabolism that gives them a you know gives them some kind of rule of thumb, like you'd be better on a low fat diet and supplementing thiamine or something like that. And I'm just making up one combination of those things. um, but that's going to, I mean, there are exceptions to this rule. For example, like there's certain communities like the old order Amish where a certain genetic disorder might be overwhelmingly prevalent relative to the others. And there's certain villages, on the coast of Ireland or something where where there is like um, a higher rate of not being able to uh, make the long chain omega-3 fats that you need to have without eating fish, because they just ate so much fish that the good genes for being able to make those fatty acids from plant oils kind of disappeared or whatever. Like there are cases like that, but the problem is there are I would say 700 or 800 different possible genetic bottlenecks, and most of them are mixed in all these populations where the individual is the centerpiece that you want to look at. And the thing is, like, you can have your rule of thumb, like, if and look, the other thing is, like, these rules of thumbs aren't that useful anyway, right? Like, so you could have a rule of thumb like most people should try to eat 1 or 2 pieces of fatty fish a week, which I think is a good general rule of thumb. And it just so happens that, like, if you're from this coastal village, off Ireland or whatever, maybe you're screwed if you don't follow that rule of thumb, whereas other people are just like not as well off if they don't follow it. But if you were following it, you wouldn't really need to know your genetics on that, right? Like, so I think it's much more interesting to, and there's a lot of genes that I would call don't be vegan genes, but I wouldn't be vegan anyway. And so, and it's not a knock against vegans, but it's just if you're not doing that out of a highly modern philosophical system, um, that and you just wanted to like analyze what is the most nutritionally robust diet, veganism would never take a spot anywhere. So you could make arguments that like maybe you should cut down animal products, but there's just no way to splice it that a low like a very low animal product diet would not be more nutritionally robust if it had 1 oyster, 1 clam, and 1 ounce of liver. And in the like, you could, like, if you had 1 oyster, 1 clam, and 1 ounce of liver a day, and then the rest of your diet was plant foods, you'd be almost vegan. But that would be radically more nutritionally robust. So there's no argument from a nutritional perspective whatsoever to take out the last 20 grams of animal products from your diet when those 20 grams could afford such great nutrition. And so as a consequence of that, yeah, I mean, yeah, some people should be thinking about the don't be vegan genes, but I don't care about them because I'm not going to advocate veganism for like strict veganism for anyone. And so I guess what I'm saying is if you just carve out good rules of thumb that are just broadly applicable to everyone, um, you don't need to think about details of people's ancestry that much to do that. And then if you're trying to say, well, what's the next step to level up? If you want to be something more specific to you, you should probably just dig deep into the whole genome sequencing rabbit hole before you try to say, well, I'm 1/4 Greek and I'm 1/3 Irish. And so I'm going to have like a third of my diet is going to be potatoes, a quarter of it's going to be feta cheese, like that. You know what I'm saying? Like you can have
Yeah.
fun with that, but you know,
Yeah, so it seems like, obviously what people really enjoy and what gets popular are extreme diets because it becomes very tribal And it's sort of a religious thing where it's like, do this, not that, right? You can't do that because you're vegan. If you have one egg a week, you are no longer vegan. Even if that would be, like you said, if you had one oyster, you'd probably be much healthier. But you can't label yourself as vegan, and so there's an identity wrapped into that. If you're a carnivore, if you're a keto person, it's like, if you eat a piece of fruit, like, it's all over, like, you're no longer that thing. Um and uh so if people were to approach their diet more intuitively, or just, oh, I feel better eating this. Um, and then I have a craving for this thing. And there's no rules. So there's no reason why I can't eat a piece of fruit, or I can't eat a piece of cheese or something that breaks the laws of the diet. So for, you know, in, if there's populations like the Inuit, or, certain isolated tribes who have, uh, like you said, they're very, inbred in the sense that they don't have a lot of genetic diversity, and they've had specific selective pressures over long times. Unless you are like completely descendant from one of those tribes, looking at a hyper specific ancestral diet is probably just a complete, waste of time. And at least until you could get into your individual genome, which is then not no longer this kind of like cultural artifact. It's just like you with your own kind of, um, yeah, genetic coding, I guess. So yeah, if you're not from a hyper specific, secluded, isolated tribe, would you say that, like, you have what you mentioned, these kind of like very general rules for the average population, and then it just has to come down to a lot of self experimentation, at least until that genomic science is there. I feel like people often, they just give up the authority to someone else when they can't just go, oh, you know what, this makes me feel better and this doesn't, so I'm gonna actually listen to that.
Yeah, I think that so first of all, I think that on the self experimentation thing, not everyone is cut out to do experiments, and so I think that definitely. To be fair, I think maybe we don't give enough advice about how to do good experiments, and so maybe the problem is really that most people aren't preaching their dietary approaches as experiments; they're preaching them as things that work. So, like, I had a couple. I had a consulting client about a month ago who I saw for the first time, and this person went to CrossFit with someone who had autonomic dysfunction, and went keto and took, I think she took thiamine too, and cured the autonomic dysfunction. And so this person did the same thing and got 5 times worse. And then we looked the at the lab work, and it looked like, well, that's because um, this first time client, their lab work looked a lot like a fatty acid oxidation disorder. And I like, obviously, if someone is an adult and has to go on an extreme diet to elicit that kind of lab work, it might never have been caught at all. And so it's not at the level of well, I guess what I'm trying to say is the proportion of people who have, like I was saying before, the proportion of people who have an individual bottleneck in something like this, in a particular energy metabolism pathway, that may not do anything obvious that looks like that until it's maximally stressed, is probably pretty high. Um, and so, I'm just assuming off the bat that the friend probably has a defect in a thiamine dependent pathway. That And there's a book by Derek Lonsdale, um, thi- I forget the whole title, but it's a book about thiamine and dysautonomia. And a lot of the case reports that they have in the book are, the people wind up having some mutation in a thiamine transporter or thiamine dependent enzyme. And because thiamine is disproportionately involved in carbohydrate metabolism, this whole class of anything related to thiamine, almost everything related to thiamine, basically makes you a very good candidate for a high fat diet and a very terrible candidate for a carb heavy diet. And it also makes you highly able, a very good candidate for megadosing thiamine. Um, Now, a lot of people have the author of this book was before he got Lonsdale got into um, broader nutrition. He came as a specialist in treating rare genetic defects in thiamine metabolism. And so he is coming from the place of broadening out what he's doing to a bigger population and arguing that thiamine is generally more important. But what a lot of people, certain people have taken the book and then tried popularizing the principles, and the genetic stuff has gotten a little lost in the process. And so there's a lot of people out there who just think low carb diets and thiamine are the treatment for autonomic dysfunction, when in fact improving cellular energy metabolism is the generalizable principle that treats autonomic dysfunction. And some people need to do that with thiamine, and some people need to do that with keto, and some people need to do that with a low fat diet, and some people need to do it with riboflavin, and so on. And so the problem is that someone's starting, right. So this person didn't really start out as like, I'm going to do an experiment on myself. It was more like, oh, that worked for you, I should try it. But neither of them, and this is not their fault, but you trace back to whoever first uh promulgated the idea that reached the friend that keto and thiamine are good for autonomic dysfunction. Someone was doing that in a way that was not saying, there's 700 possible bottlenecks in your energy metabolism, and if you find the right one, you can probably treat your autonomic dysfunction. And one of them responds, or five of them respond to keto and thiamine. Then that person would have been like, oh, I should try to probably like get my feet wet, and if this is helping, step on the pedal a little bit and be careful, and then step on the pedal faster if it seems like I'm getting a lot of benefit, and then being open-minded to reap whatever benefit that I can, but acknowledge that maybe I'm going to hit a wall or I'm going to hit some imbalance or something at some point. And then the friend could have said, well, maybe I also have one of these 5 out of 7 or 800 things causing my autonomic dysfunction, and I'll do that, right? Like, if that was the mindset, then I think that a lot of people could be good self-experimenters. But I think the problem is more with us who are, we who are preaching the stuff to try are not collectively doing a good job framing things as experiments that people should run.
Right. So we have the this thing is the answer. This is what fixes the problem, not I have this issue and I'm trying this to see, what this does, and then later down the line I might have to do something very different as I sort of get closer and closer to a healthier place.
Yeah. But I think you had thrown in a couple of questions, and I don't know if I answered all of them, but I guess, broadly speaking, I would say that in terms of kind of medium, like low hanging fruit would be the sort of, and we can, I mean, it's not obvious to everyone, but like, you know, um, eat whole foods, eat a balanced diet, exercise, go outside, um, you know, manage stress, and like all this basic stuff. I think if you go up to the next level right after that, you're probably looking at something like, um, not requiring any massive skill or expertise. I think a good rule of thumb would be you should perform limited experiments with the different types of macro distributions and kind of popular diets or whatever to find what leads to the most optimal body composition with the least amount of effort in regulating your appetite and produces the best sleep and feeling of energy during the day. Right, like I think that most people could probably spend a couple of months going through a couple of weeks on a few different types of major dietary themes, and they would probably realize fairly quickly that, oh, if I just take all the bread out of my diet, my waist starts going down 3/4 of an inch a week. And, just if you can find something that unlocks effortless optimization of body composition, it's probably doing something good for your energy metabolism. And if you kind of monitor your health on that, right? Like, there are exceptions. Sometimes something causes dramatic weight loss and also causes horrible symptoms or whatever. But if you can find that mixed through self experimentation, that causes an improvement in the feeling of well being alongside effortless optimization of body composition, you're probably very on track toward the thing that's, the mix of things that's right for you without having to go down any scientific rabbit holes.
Yeah, you see the types of extreme things that people go into, and then when that just really, d- people hit a point where like this is not working. I have to do something different, and then they tend to go, perhaps very much the opposite way. So, I mean, think about how many times you've seen the former vegan is now a carnivore, or they're eating raw meat or something because they deprive themselves of these nutrients for such a long time that what they're have excesses of and what they're deficient in, they can actually probably even be completely extreme for a period of time, and they're going to only get benefits. Similarly, a lot of people who were in the keto thing or carnivore, various low carb diets, then they get into like the repeat thing and they start eating like lots of carbs. um you know I probably ideally the solution would be like not going so extreme, one way. And then of course, having to then almost seems like you're so deficient in something that you have to kind of tip the scale with so much pressure the other way. Do you think that, like, what is really happening when someone kind of goes on and flips on something like that? Is there like I've been eating these foods, and so I have now an abundance of these nutrients and perhaps even too much of them, and then a deficiency? Or is there something a little bit more in depth that's kind of being balanced out versus just kind of like a, a nutrient store deficiency thing, kind of more of a um, perhaps an endocrine type thing, or metabolic type idea?
Uh, well, I mean, all you mentioned was the behavioral component of that, and I think with that alone, meaning what happened to their health and all the other stuff. Like, so I think a lot just in that behavioral dynamic, a lot of that is probably just the intersection of personality type and culture. So, I mean, some people just bounce around between extreme things all the time, and I had a relative who, I grew up in a very traditional Orthodox Christian household, and but I had an uncle who went really deep into some kind of split off hyper traditionalist thing for 20 years and then became an atheist. Like, it had nothing to do with physiology or endocrinology or whatever. It's people who are prone to extremes are prone to extremes, and so I think someone who's prone to extremes is actually much more likely to bounce between two opposite extremes than they are to find a happy medium in the middle, because they are prone to extremes. And and they don't know why. It's a Billy Joel had a song about that. I don't know why I go to extremes, right? And so they don't know why, but they're over there and then they're over there and they're never in the middle because they hate the middle, So I think that's part of it. But then there's also like, so first of all, I'm not sure that extreme is actually the normal, like the quantitatively normal dynamic of ex veganism, right? So if you look at polls, generally ex vegans outnumber vegans by current vegans by 2 to 1. So definitely like the average person who becomes a vegan leaves veganism, but I doubt they're leaving veganism for carnivore very often. That's probably more something that through selection bias we see a lot of when we're looking on the internet, because the vocal people are, I mean, generally if someone winds up in a happy middle, they're not too evangelical about it, right? They're if they're pushing veganism and they're like, oh man, that didn't work, and then they're eating normal, they're probably not going to be like make a blog and call it like
Eating
the
normal.
normaldiet.com and be like, I eat what everyone else does. And all these people who think everyone else is wrong are wrong because everyone else is right. Like it's not a
There's nothing to
blog that you
sell
would
there. Yeah, there's no.
right. Yeah. Whereas, if you can say like veganism wrecked my health and now I'm carnivore because I saw the light. Um, and I was on the road to Damascus and the cow appeared to me and was like, eat of me and eat all of me, right? Or whatever, they could they have a conversion story to share, right? Now I uh I you know I you the idea that they went to one extreme and so they became depleted of something and then went to the other to replete themselves, I think that has some plausibility. But I think a lot of people also just are designed for um one extreme and not the other, right? So for example, um I probably am by default designed for something around the extreme animal product side of things. Um, Although I think that there are ways to modify that with other extremes. Um, so, for example, I until I started supplementing with mega doses of riboflavin, pretty much the only diet that was consistent with leanness for me was a mostly lean protein diet. Right, the rabbit starvation diet was like my optimal diet. But now I see with riboflavin, I I'm very fat tolerant and I'm more carbohydrate intolerant than I was before. Um, and so I'm actually gravitating towards possibly going extreme keto now. And I'm very curious to see if I can reverse the carbohydrate intolerance with thiamine. But I don't think I will be able to. I think what's happening is there are certain parts of my metabolism where there's just a unfixable bottleneck in carbohydrate metabolism, where there's a very fixable bottleneck in fat metabolism with riboflavin, and protein was sort of like the thing that needed least fixing. Um, but if you take someone who needs an extreme carnivore diet, uh, they're probably going to do the worst out of anyone on a vegan diet,
Right.
right? So, I mean, it's very possible that there are people who need one extreme and have no idea, and when they go to the opposite extreme they just get completely wrecked. And I'm one of those people. I got way more wrecked on veganism than any other ex-vegan that I know. um I know a lot of ex-vegans and I don't know anyone who got more wrecked by veganism than I did. And so I think that's a case where like my extreme needs were just the precise opposite of veganism. And in fact, I would say my health has been the worst when the rational part of me has been like, "Oh, you need to be balanced."
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
I take
Everyone.
when I take generalizable principles that I think are like the most sensible things to apply to everyone, that's when I get like fat and tired.
I definitely agree with you when you kind of say how most people kind of just need to do something general and balanced. I don't think most people are, for whatever reason, whether it's just people are so unhealthy at this point that they kind of don't have really like the mental fortitude and the physical awareness to kind of determine, how they can actually manipulate little things. And it might just be like, you know, uh, you kind of just have to play it safe with the average person. Because I think those of us who really get into health, a lot, you speak to a lot of people and it's like they got interested first because usually there's a problem they want to solve. Right. And so a lot of times those are people who have like a health issue first. Like I was really unhealthy. I had this problem. I had that problem. So I needed answers. Whereas like someone like myself, I mean, I got into these various diets primarily. I got interested in nutrition just first because I was an athlete and just wanted like better, more, right? It's like I want more muscles, I want faster, stronger, less fat, that kind of a thing. Um, and then sort of realized like, oh, I seem to just like have problems with like gut issues and bloating and stuff. And so looking at things that minimize that. So for myself, I mean, I seem to be a really, really good carb metabolizer. I've gotten like the leanest I've ever been was when I was eating like 600 grams of carbs a day. And, not like a super crazy low fat, maybe like 60 to 80 grams of fat with like a really high, like just general activity, lots of walking and stuff. But carnivore was like an instant solution for like my gut and bloating issues. And I got, and it allowed me to stay effortlessly lean, but then like you kind of feel that those energetic problems that come over time um, with being low carb, at least for myself. And so, it's like you mentioned, you can kind of pinpoint some things which solve a problem, but then maybe another thing gets a little bit worse. And so, like for yourself, you mentioned like you might have to become a worse carb metabolizer to get to your optimal health, right? Is that like kind of how you frame that?
Um, Not really. I think what happened, I think it's more cause and effect is reversed.
Okay.
So what happened was riboflavin. Um, at a higher level, let's say this: energy metabolism, energy wants to flow down the path of least resistance, and so um, generally speaking, the sort of end result that is least the like the easiest place for energy to go is to be dissipated as heat. But there are, when you eat a piece of food, there's many dozens, if not hundreds, of steps that have to take place for all the different things in that to be dissipated as heat as you move or as you fuel your heartbeat or whatever. And uh, and so as a result of that, if there is something that makes carbohydrate harder to break down or fat harder to break down, it's possible that the path of least resistance is actually just to become fat rather than to become heat. Um, and at the expense of doing useful things, including maintaining a good gut health, among those things. Um, and so I have genetic abnormalities in fat metabolism that are fixable with riboflavin. And so before I started riboflavin, the path of most resistance was fat. And so burning fat did not interfere with my glucose metabolism that much. And I tended to correspond to normal textbook physiology, which is that you prioritize carbohydrate oxidation over fat oxidation. And so like the general textbook view supported by research in the average people who make up scientific studies shows that if you eat pasta with olive oil, uh, if that exceeded the calories that you needed to burn, all the olive oil would wind up in your adipose tissue. And I mean, not literally the oil, but the fats that are in the olive oil would wind up in your adipose tissue, and the pasta would get burned for energy. And you wouldn't burn the olive oil fats for energy until you got done burning the pasta carbs for energy. But when I started riboflavin, I flipped that on its head, and I started oxidizing fats in preference to carbohydrates, such that if I'm in caloric balance, my carbohydrates won't get burned for energy, and my fats will. And I I first noticed this as as my weight staying the same or increasing while my waist circumference, with no change in my diet, all I did was add riboflavin. My waist circumference just started dramatically decreasing while my weight stayed the same or increased. And usually I measure both because I expect if I'm losing weight, I always expect to lose more weight than waist circumference. If you take like the average, like if you go in look at a study on long-term weight loss, what's the average pounds and what's the average inches off the waist. And so you just take, I forget what the number is, but you just take the long-term average of inches off the waist per pound lost. I would always expect, if I start losing weight, to lose more weight than I lost waist inches, because I'm going to lose glycogen and I'm going to lose water and so on, right? So that's the only reason I measure them together. And what I found was I started riboflavin and I saw a trend I'd never seen before in my life, which is that my waist circumference started going down while my weight stayed the same or went up. And I interpreted that to be that I was losing, that my body was sparing glycogen to burn visceral fat. And I wasn't doing like a daily DEXA or anything, so I can't really prove that that's what was happening. But that was what seemed to be the case to me. And then I got hungrier, and I made the mistake of adding carbs. And as I added carbs, I got fat. And generally speaking, I would say that in dramatic contrast to your experience, I would say roughly as a guesstimate that every 10 grams of carbs in my diet produces zero point 0.1 inches on my waist, totally irrespective of the caloric load of my diet. So I'm telling you, I when I realized I was getting fat on riboflavin, I thought riboflavin was making me fat, and I'm like, why am I getting fat when the first week or two was characterized by losing all these inches off my waist? And I went back and I realized that it was that I had responded to the hunger by adding carbs. But I realized this after what I did was before I realized that I said I'm going to take out 300 calories of my diet as added oils. So I kept my diet exactly the same and took out 300 calories of added oils, and nothing happened to my waist circumference or my weight. Um, and then I started making isocaloric substitutions of those 300 calories. I was like, what if I take the carbs out instead? What if I replace it with protein? What if I replace it with MCTs? And so I just did these 300 calorie substitutions. Um, and just like completely unambiguously, it was the carbs that were making me fat. Because if I isocalorically substitute fat or protein, I get lean. But this is in total contrast to pre-riboflavin. The only thing that if I added fat to my diet, I will always get fat prior to riboflavin. So it's very distinctly post riboflavin. A high fat diet um, will not make me fat and will instead make me lean. This was never true before I added riboflavin. So now, as I've done that, because I'm burning fat, I am getting leaner, and I'm not burning glucose, so my glucose goes up per unit of glucose consumed. So right now I'm on a diet where I took the carbs out of every meal except lunch, and I kept my lunch carbs the same, and then I measure my glucose, ketones, and lactate 1 hour after lunch. And my glucose would usually be in the 90s pre-riboflavin and not just pre-riboflavin, pre me switching to a high fat, low carb diet on riboflavin. Usually my glucose would be in the 90s and my lactate would be like 1.2. And now my lactate is 0.6 and my glucose is like 120, because being on the high fat riboflavin regime is making me burn the fat in the lunch instead of the carbs. And so my glycolysis is slowing down to the point where even my lactate is getting cut in half, so that my glucose, it effectively goes through the roof. I mean, because it's like 120 compared to 95 is not hugely different as a percentage of the total. But if you just chop off, like if you say like normal glucose is 85, then like 95 versus 120 is sort of going through the roof, like relative to the healthy baseline fasting level, right? Um, so the causation is flipped. It's not that I had to get more glucose intolerant in order to get healthier. It's that I fixed my fat metabolism, and so now my body, my body doesn't give a flying f about what my blood glucose is. Within like my body doesn't want me to go into a diabetic coma, but blood glucose is not the central metric of health like everyone thinks it is. And my body wants the energy to go down the path of least resistance. If there's a block, if the block in, it's not that I have a new block in carbohydrate metabolism. It's just that I didn't remove the block that was already there, and I did remove the block in fat metabolism. You just imagine like a pinball falling down wherever, the pinball comes down the pinball machine in the path of least resistance. If there's a thing here, it doesn't try to break through, it just goes down here. And if you got the two levers up, it's not like, can I break through one of the levers? And if you take one down, it's not going to be like, well, I don't always want to go down the one that's down, like I got to get some of the glucose in. Like it's not going to do that. It's just going to fall down wherever the block has been removed. And your energy metabolism is doing exactly the same thing. If you remove a block in the fat metabolism, and it's now easy to burn fat, you're not going to be like, well, I, as the hypothalamus, believe that a healthy blood glucose postprandially is 115 is better than 120, so I'm gonna like try to manage. No, you're just going to, the energy is gonna fall into fat metabolism, and the carbs are like whatever. I didn't get, like, why would I push this carb into this pathway when it is easier to push the fat into that pathway to get the same ATP load? Your body wants energy, uh, much more than it wants to micromanage blood glucose.
Um, okay, so right, this we're talking about something that's like, you know, hyper specific to you, right? So someone listening to this
Well, we
doesn't.
could talk about what's hyper specific to you. I mean, if
Oh
I
yeah,
went
for
on,
sure.
many people, if they went on the 500-gram carb a day diet that made you effortlessly lean, they would be effortlessly massively fat.
Right. No, no, I didn't point that to say like you're like an aberration and I'm normal or something. I just meant like the average person should not then, look at me and go, well, I should eat 500 grams of carbs a day, but then also not go, all I have to do is just mega dose riboflavin and, like all my problems
Well,
will.
that would be dumb. I'm sure there are many other people that would have a similar experience as I had. It's just that, what are they? One in 1,000? I'm not sure.
Right. So, like how does someone, you have found this thing that has like, yeah, you were talking about getting to that path of least resistance that gives you that health and energy, and your waistline gets smaller. So like do people have to do some kind of genomic testing to get to answers like that?
Um, well, yeah. I mean, to be honest, like a lot of people couldn't afford it. I mean, I was talking about how the whole genome sequencing is, the price is quite affordable, but then to getting someone who can help you make sense of it, becomes another level. I think that, yeah, no, I don't think that everyone has to do whole genome sequencing to be healthy. But I think, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying before, right? Like there's the lowest hanging fruit is the stuff that most of us can kind of largely agree on, like eat whole foods, eat a balanced diet, get outdoors, be active, use your brain, be social, manage stress well. Like and that all those are, each of those is its own, you know, Pandora's box of many, many things that could come out of that and could be said about it. But just broadly speaking, there's good health advice that we can give the general public, that will largely play out well for most people. And then I think the question then becomes, are you happy with the health that you have when you are following the general principles of what is good to do for everyone? And then there will be several categories of dissatisfaction among subset of those people. Some of them will be very sick. Some of them will be very healthy and have no idea what's wrong with them because nothing is, but they're optimizers. And some of those will be very performance oriented. I really imagine, for example, that someone is high level athlete, took home silver in the Olympics, did everything sport specific that is correct for that sport, did every is doing everything, has the best trainers in the world, um, who believe that that athlete is doing everything right. Now, if that athlete does whole genome sequencing and finds that they have mutation, they're heterozygous for a mutation in pyruvate dehydrogenase that is, only the enzyme only works correctly on 500 to 2,000 milligrams of thiamine a day. That person could, may well, and this is hypothetical, but I would imagine that person could probably unlock gold by fixing that one bottleneck that's idiosyncratic and unique to them. Um, and so, you like, it doesn't matter why the person wants to go to a next level. I think when you've gotten the low hanging fruit, no matter who you are and why you want to go higher, if you need somewhere to go, you need to climb up the tree to go to the next. And you don't go right to the top down some bizarre rabbit hole that costs thousands of dollars, and you got to go get a degree to think about it correctly or just trust someone. You go up to the next, the next step up. Um, and so I don't think you get straight to like, what is my most unique idiosyncratic bottleneck in my energy metabolism quite yet. But at some point, if you keep climbing the tree, you get there. And but a lot of people should just be quite like some people are just very healthy and don't have a they don't need to, ever since I stopped eating junk food, I don't get sick. My libido's through the roof. I don't have any wrinkles. I've got a big family and feel like I'm well rested all the time. Like,
Yeah.
maybe they don't care, and maybe they shouldn't.
So, for that more like low hanging fruit, and especially because, any probably most of my followers and people who would be listening to this and going from like the world that I've been in comes from a, ancestrally focused kind of approach that tends to include a lot of these low carb and carnivore type approaches. And so I kind of want to talk to people who like have kind of been in the low carb thing for a while. And maybe sort of be like carbs maybe aren't like the worst thing that's ever happened, and like every problem in the world is because of carbohydrates. What would you say to people kind of in that mindset and kind of come from that world? What do you think is like the most misunderstood thing about carbohydrates and what they do to us?
Um,
Like, how would you kind of maybe enlighten those people to maybe break them out of that kind of mindset where just like carbs is all the problems are just attributable to carbs?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess one of the first things that I might point out is that insulin is a fundamentally good for you hormone that positively regulates, meaning it stimulates antioxidant defense against glycation, production of thyroid hormone, production of sex hormones, uh, down regulation of stress hormones. and is generally something that you want more of if you're sensitive to it, and you want to develop sensitivity to it so you can get more of it. I think that would probably be the first thing that might make someone go, what? That might open up a conversation.
And in getting towards that more sensitive place, maybe sugar isn't like the sort of end all be all cause of insulin resistance in the first place.
Oh, I think the concept of insulin resistance is kind of total BS. Um, I mean, it's very like the way that it's framed is very evocative of. I don't know if this is like a cultural thing um, where researchers are generally kind of like middle management position in like an academic researcher is kind of a middle manager. They got a lot of bureaucrats over their head, but they have kind of a fiefdom of grad students who do all the heavy lifting around, and then they sort of like use them to get lots of papers out. And so the way that they've framed hormones is kind of to exonerate the middle manager as the top dog, that they like to see themselves as, or something like this. So um if you were like a corporate manager and you were in charge of a team, and like consistently your team did not do what you said, your boss is probably going to come to you and be like, why is the team not doing any work that you're in charge of? I think you're doing something wrong. And you'd be like, well, they have manager resistance. I would be like, the team has Masterjohn resistance, and we have to fix it, but it's certainly not my fault. Um, I mean, that's like insulin resistance. Like, what is insulin? It is a message made by the pancreas to gauge not the blood glucose at all, but to gauge the degree to which there is glucose available to make ATP from, because glucose does not elicit insulin response. Glucose gets metabolized to ATP in the pancreatic beta cell, and ATP elicits the release of insulin from the pancreatic beta cell. And the pancreas is wired to make ATP disproportionately from glucose, hence the disproportionate effect of glucose on insulin. But the pancreas, if you have a block in carbohydrate metabolism, you are not going to make as much insulin in response to the same carbohydrate load, because glucose doesn't release insulin. ATP releases insulin after it's made from glucose in the pancreatic beta cell. And then that insulin then communicates to the muscle cell, to the adipose cell, how much glucose was effectively turned into ATP within the pancreatic beta cell, to help make an inference about glucose and more broadly energy availability. And then the muscle or the adipose cell decides what to do with that information. And the muscle cell cares about the rest of the body, but cares mostly about the muscle cell. And if the muscle cell cannot metabolize glucose right now because it's already has too much glucose, or whenever it tries to burn glucose, it makes a bunch of reactive oxygen species that are damaging the mitochondria or whatever, the muscle cell is going to decide, it's going to take in the information that it has internally, it's going to take the external message of the insulin, and it's going to decide what to do with it. And so, why would you frame that as insulin resistance when, in fact, it's the muscle making a decision about what to do with its own metabolism now that it has a piece of information that the pancreas had given it? Like, the muscle's considering many other pieces of information, like what is AMPK inside me saying? What is citrate inside me saying? What is ATP inside me saying? Insulin is one message that is external, that is integrated with many other internal messages as well as other external messages the muscle makes an integrated decision about what amount of glucose is it best for me to uptake. And so I think that the reason that now you could you could say, well, yeah, but why don't we just call that insulin resistance and the muscle's not taking it up? Because the problem with that is there anything in that entire pathway can be going wrong, right? There's things that can go wrong in the pancreas. Before the pancreas, there's things that can go wrong in the liver because the pancreas only sees the amount of glucose that the liver didn't first take up. You absorb glucose, it goes to the liver first. The pancreas doesn't even see the initial glucose load that went through the portal vein. It only sees what the liver did not take up and left to go to the pancreas. Um, so there are so many opportunities and so many things for something to be altered that could lead to the ratio of glucose to insulin in the blood being high. I think to capture it all and just bag it as insulin resistance, I think is an extremely it's the level of analysis is way too general, and it's capturing way too many disparate things going on. And it's also missing it's also sort of like reframing falsely insulin into like a glucose centric hormone, which I think is not a fair characterization of insulin because it doesn't affect glucose metabolism more than it affects fat metabolism, or glutathione metabolism, or like hundreds of things that are not involved in macronutrient metabolism that are stimulated by insulin. Um, I think anyone who's making an insulin resistance metric is doing it with the ratio of glucose to insulin in the blood or some kind of derivative of that. And I think it's just grossly oversimplifying so many different things. Like it's grossly oversimplifying what actually is contributing to that ratio being different, and it's also grossly oversimplifying like what are the other things that insulin's supposed to be doing, and are those becoming resistant or not? Um, so I mean, to go back to whether sugar is yeah, I mean, to go back to whether like sugar is the cause of insulin resistance. I think that would be crazy anyway to say that. Um, but it's much more interesting to me that I would rather like completely turn on its head the whole concept of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yes, sugar is not the universal cause of insulin resistance. That's stupid.
Right. But I mean, that's it's very interesting what you bring up. I wouldn't call myself like a super science expert, so a lot of the stuff that you're saying is either like stuff I haven't thought about before, or even some of it like going over my head. But I think it's important to what you're talking about is that like a lot of these things that have become in like the health sphere where people are, and maybe even the alternative health sphere, a lot of stuff that gets drastically misinterpreted and oversimplified. And I think similar to things like glucose and insulin resistance, the topic of serotonin is one of those things that I feel like we've just been getting browbeat about for some time now, both like from like the origin of antidepressants, and then people in these health spheres talking about, oh, like how do we these things, oh, this is great because it increases serotonin, and this very oversimplified kind of perspective on it. And you had this amazing thread recently sort of kind of talking about this like misconception of serotonin and how it's this kind of stress avoidance sort of coping mechanism. Could you elaborate more on that, for especially for people who wouldn't have seen that thread, to describe what serotonin kind of is
Yeah,
and
so
does?
I see serotonin as a dissociation chemical, and I think the most popular conception of serotonin is that it's a feel good chemical. And I think feel good is totally wrong. I think stress coping is a decent approximation. I've used it before, but I think a dissociation chemical is probably where you get the lowest common denominator of all the things that serotonin is doing. So the positive spin on that is that you do want a healthy level of serotonin that creates a healthy level of distance of whatever the particular target that's relevant to the tissue that the serotonin is in. So in the gut, serotonin is providing a basal serotonin is providing a basal level of gut motility, and that gut motility is helping moving things along and is essentially keeping a certain level of distance between you and your food. And so, the healthy level of distance between you and your food allows the food to move along at a pace that you can extract what you want from it, leave the rest behind, and that gives you very good nutrient absorption, very well formed feces, very regular bowel movements. In the brain, I think a normal healthy basal level of serotonin is giving you a normal healthy basal level of distance between yourself and your stress. And so it does wind up as a stress coping support in that sense, because you need a healthy level of, well, I should say in the gut, like if you close the distance between you and your food, that is basically where everything in the food kind of randomly distributes between yourself and the food, maybe gets stuck in the gut, and you absorb too much of what you shouldn't, you don't absorb enough of what you should, etc. In the mind, I think if you don't have enough serotonin, you will identify with your stressors to an extent that you should not. And I think that can produce a feeling of overwhelm. So for example, if something bad happens in your day, if you identify with this, I am a bad person, which is why bad things happen to me. This is being, way too enmeshed with the stress that you're experiencing. And I think a basal level of serotonin allows a certain level of distance where you can compartmentalize, this is me. I'm a good person. I deserve good things. Bad things happen to everyone. I have a problem. I'll figure out how to fix it. Now, if you ramp the serotonin up in the gut, what you get is diarrhea. And this is, complete dissociation between you and your food. It just leaves and takes, whatever it wants along with it. And in the brain, there are, I think the sort of maximal serotonin in the brain, and it really depends where it is, but just as generally speaking, is basically schizophrenia, which, the schizo in schizophrenia is you're cutting the mind, uh, dissociating it from reality. And there's a similarity between that and psychedelics, which originally were called psychotomimetics, because the field of psychiatry was hoping that they could produce a temporary psychotic experience in the psychiatrist that would allow them to understand what is always happening in a schizophrenic. Um, but the cultural leaders, uh, Timothy O'Leary and his friends, Leary, excuse me, um, they wound up choosing psychedelic because it was like much more amenable to a mass movement. But the point is that LSD and other psychedelics act on a subset of serotonin receptors in order to produce this temporary experience. And so I think if you take a modern view of psychedelics, you could say, well, under and I don't do psychedelics, but other people do, and they use it as kind of like hacking the controlled psychotic experience in order to provoke a, I mean, like if you look at if you watch Michael Pollan's documentary about psychedelics, one of the things that comes up a lot is being able to dissociate yourself from the default mode network, which is your internal narrative of like the thinking part of your brain that's always on, that defines who you are. And so serotonin in a in precise parts of the brain, activating serotonin allows you to dissociate not just from your stress, but from your own internal narrative of who you are, which can provide this, um, in the case of psychedelic use, can be a highly that is, I guess, not everyone uses psychedelics in a highly controlled manner, but you could use it in theory as a highly controlled biohack of the serotonin system to temporarily, for toward a specific goal, induce a greater level of dissociation than you would usually have by dissociating you not only from your experience but even from your own internal narrative, which, it makes sense that that could provide opportunities to maybe fix something about your internal narrative, because if you're enmeshed in it, it's sort of, you're the fish that in the water that can't see the water.
Is that what
um,
people refer to as ego death?
well, I think that's sort of like a certain, there's degrees of it, right? But I think, yeah, if you acutely experience the I am not an individual person at all, um, that's a very acute maximal dissociation between you and yourself, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so, now the thing is, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to dissociate yourself from your stress. And there are some studies in humans showing that serotonin is responsible for aversion behavior in response to punishment. And so experimentally, you can have someone engage in a behavior that they like or want, and then you can like give them an electric shock. And one attitude you could have is like, well, I really want that thing, but I really don't want to get shocked, so I'm not gonna pursue what I want because I don't want to get shocked. And another attitude you could have is like, shock me, go ahead and shock me, mother. I'm gonna take my thing, right? And so the more serotonin you have, the more you're like, yeah, I really want that, but I don't know if I can handle getting shocked. And the less serotonin you have, the more you're like, get at me, mother, shock me up,
Bring
line
it
me up to
on.
get shocked. And so, if you translate that into regular human life, I imagine that would translate as, kind of like conflict avoidance, right? Like, I really should have this conversation with my wife, but she's probably going to get sad, and man, I really can't handle it when she gets sad. So maybe I'll talk to her about it tomorrow. And then you do the same thing for the next 4 years, and then resentment builds up, and you get a divorce. So like that's, I'm just making up the story, but that's like, cowardice, I think, is how you would describe that level of conflict avoidance, when there's something that you need to do or you should do or would produce the best outcome, but you are more concerned with avoiding the discomfort that could be in the way of doing that than you are with the actual goal in mind. Then I think that produces cowardice. And I think with the school shooter phenomenon, it's like pop the SSRI in the machine and produce the dissociation, and they hate the world that they live in, and so they will dissociate themselves from it by destroying it, which is a different strategy that the schizophrenic has, by dissociating themselves from the world that they can't handle by their mind exiting reality. But it's analogous in the sense that, it's a means of achieving the end of maximal dissociation. And and I think that frames serotonin in a very different way. And I think it suddenly everything can make sense, where, why is a feel good chemical making people suicidal, right? Like, suicide is an alternative strategy to separate yourself from the world that you can't handle or that you hate. I like, I mean, just just listening to like a suicide letter or a schizophrenic talk about their experience, or reading like a tome from a school shooter, I get the sense that the school shooter abhors their reality, and the schizophrenic and the suicidal person feels helpless in their reality. So I think it's that, like, the way it plays out is partly driven by whatever that feeling of overwhelm is. But what's in common is that there's a feeling of overwhelm, and then you spike the serotonin up high enough, and the strategy for dealing with that overwhelm becomes to maximally dissociate yourself from it by what turns out to be an extreme and extremely maladaptive and possibly extremely sociopathic way of achieving that separation.
So, the thing with SSRIs, the way that kind of conventional wisdom frames it is that, people who go on them and then either commit suicide or do something like a school shooting, they kind of frame it like it made them just not depressed enough to actually, like, it made them be not a coward enough to go through with whatever the thing is, versus what you're saying sounds more like it made them so more coward like that they actually took the step to create that final separation. Would that be sort of a correct interpretation of that?
I mean, maybe I'm not well versed enough in the narratives around the school shooters, but I can't imagine anyone would say like, "Wow, that was really brave."
well, well, yeah. I mean, not in that sense, right? But it's sort of like, this idea of people who are depressed, and it sort of is kind of thought of as like a state of like not doing things. So actually being active in some way, whether it be, committing suicide or doing the shooting, is like considered to be like they finally got off the couch and did
Yeah, I
something
think the
about it.
problem with that is that there's no morality in it.
Right.
Like if you just impose a morality on the action, then suddenly it matters whether what you're doing is good or not, right? So like if you sort of like take a moral position that going to school and shooting it up is wrong, then there's, it's much more courageous to sit at home and cry, and like have the moral fortitude to be like, um, this sucks for me, but I'm going to respond to it sucking for me by making sure that it only sucks for me until I figure my shit out.
Right. I'm
Like
not calling
that's
these people brave. I'm
no,
just saying like, yeah,
I know
yeah.
you're not, but I'm saying like I think the difference in like the narrative that that you're attributing to whoever is saying it, I think is I think where it's going wrong is that it has no morality attached. Like, I guess what I'm saying is you cannot analyze courage separated from morality.
Right.
Like go into any traditional story about a hero, and uh, what the story is trying to evoke is that there is a level of action and self-sacrifice and um, duty, uh, that are all wrapped up in courage, right? It's like it's analyzing courage only from the level of action taken, like the magnitude of the action, and not the moral context of the action. I think the problem there is the lack of morality, the lack of a moral angle in the analysis. And so I don't think that's all that much to do with the serotonin thing. Like I think it's like the people who are defending SSRIs probably need more like a better moral compass.
Well, I mean, I think that's probably objectively true. I don't think I would, or anyone that would be listening to this would probably doubt that. But yeah, but just sort of like, I'm trying to conceptualize this in sort of a more mechanistic framework where it's like that step to do that horrible thing is a step further towards the disassociation. It's an act of greater cowardice. It's a more avoidance. Um, whereas the traditional framework is like, well, it's making them a little bit better, but it didn't make them good enough to like then not do the thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially if they kill themselves at the end, you have to evoke maximum cowardice because they just like took a stand for something that they refused to be around to to accept the consequences of.
Right. It's like
Like
it would have been.
you didn't really have the guts to go kill someone if you killed yourself afterwards, because you like to say that you have the gut. It's sort of like, I don't know, if you um it's like if you went to a coffee shop and you asked a girl out and then you ran away immediately before she could respond. Like, you wouldn't be like, that dude has balls, you would be like, what up,
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, I asked that girl out. It's like, really? It's like, yeah, yeah, what happened?
Well,
It's
I don't know. I didn't want to stick around and risk rejection.
yeah. Um, no, I mean, because there's a lot of maybe not like the school shootings, but things that are more considered like gang shootings are often called like suicide by cop, right? Like, it's like, you didn't have the guts to like kill yourself, so you made it so that someone else could like even do it for you, right? There's like these levels to these acts which could be considered, these horrible acts, which we might, if we want to sort of analyze them from like a more physiological standpoint, like might be driven by serotonin with these like degrees of retreat, of disassociation, of um, unwillingness to face whatever it is that is causing problems, or just the world itself, I guess. But it does seem like if someone had depression or any of these issues, giving them SSRIs would just be like about the worst thing you could possibly do for them.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't use it as a first resort, and that I think psychiatry does. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, it would be like a very last resort rather than a first resort, and I think psychiatry sees it largely as a first resort.
So this would probably be a good point to now, in talking about maybe the pharmaceutical industry, and we could talk about whether they're just really bad at what they do or whether they're malicious in what they do. We
Hey,
can,
could we take a quick bathroom break?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll be back in a minute.
Okay.